By late 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had become a struggle over sustainment more than maneuver. The United States and its allies treated Guadalcanal as the forward hinge of a wider Solomon Islands advance, because holding Henderson Field enabled daytime air cover over the sea lanes that linked Australia, New Caledonia, and the New Hebrides to the contested slot. Japan, operating from the major base complex at Rabaul and from airfields and seaplane anchorages farther down the chain, treated Guadalcanal as both a barrier to Allied movement and a potential springboard toward New Guinea and the Bismarcks. On the ground, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal faced declining combat power, driven by malnutrition, disease, and the limited capacity of destroyer-run resupply missions commonly termed the Tokyo Express. By the end of 1942, Japanese Army and Navy leaders concluded that holding the island was no longer feasible and received approval to evacuate the remaining garrison rather than attempt another major reinforcement effort. That decision produced Operation K, a naval withdrawal plan built around night destroyer runs, supported by an air campaign intended to complicate Allied interference. Allied reconnaissance and radio intercepts detected preparations, but many Allied staffs interpreted the signals as indicators of a renewed Japanese offensive aimed at retaking Guadalcanal, not a withdrawal. This misreading mattered operationally. Both sides prepared to protect different kinds of movements on the same routes at the same time. For the Allied command in the South Pacific, the immediate priority in late January 1943 was to keep troop and supply traffic moving into Guadalcanal, while maintaining enough surface strength forward to respond if Japanese heavy units appeared. U.S. naval planning therefore paired transport movements with a covering force of cruisers and destroyers operating between Guadalcanal and the Southern Solomons. In contemporary U.S. reporting, this was framed as covering operations for a Cactus troop convoy, using the Guadalcanal code name to describe the protected movement. Geography shaped how both sides assessed risk. Rennell Island sits on the southern approach to Guadalcanal, about 120 miles south by sea routes used for screening and approach, and its surrounding waters lie within reach of land-based aircraft staging from the northern Solomons and Rabaul. The result was a predictable tactical problem. A surface force could maneuver and fight by night, but by day it operated under the threat of torpedo bombers able to search wide areas and strike beyond the range of shipboard guns. The Battle of Rennell Island, fought on January 29 to 30, 1943, emerged from this intersection of intentions. Japan sought to shield an evacuation plan and exploit land-based air power against U.S. surface cover, while the United States sought to secure convoy movements and be positioned to engage what it believed might be a major Japanese surface response. On the 29th of January 1943, the Allied troop movement toward Guadalcanal proceeded under a layered naval cover directed by Admiral William F. Halsey. The transport group itself comprised 4 transports with 4 destroyers as close escort. Ahead of it, on the southern approach line between Guadalcanal and Rennell Island, Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen commanded Task Force 18 from the heavy cruiser USS Wichita. His striking group included heavy cruisers, Wichita, USS Chicago, and USS Louisville, light cruisers, USS Montpelier, USS Cleveland, and USS Columbia, escort carriers, USS Chenango and USS Suwannee, and 8 destroyers, USS La Valette, USS Waller, USS Conway, USS Fraser, USS Chevalier, USS Edwards, USS Meade, and USS Taylor. The immediate operational task for Giffen was twofold: protect the convoy while moving toward Guadalcanal, then rendezvous at 9 p.m. with 4 U.S. destroyers stationed at Tulagi for a surface sweep up New Georgia Sound the next day. Speed became the first constraint. The escort carriers could make about 18 knots, while the cruiser force could sustain higher speed. At 1400 hours, Giffen detached the 2 escort carriers with 2 destroyers to remain with them and pressed ahead at about 24 knots with the cruisers and 6 destroyers. His formation reflected the threat he expected. Allied intelligence suggested submarines were likely in the area, so the screen and maneuvers emphasized anti-submarine defense rather than air attack readiness. By late afternoon, Japanese submarines tracking south of Guadalcanal reported the cruiser force's position and course. At Rabaul, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet headquarters directed a torpedo bomber strike designed to reach the U.S. force after dark. The attacking aircraft were land-based naval bombers, 16 Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 bombers from the 705 Air Group, and 16 Mitsubishi G3M Type 96 bombers from the 701 Air Group, each carrying aerial torpedoes. One G3M turned back with engine trouble, leaving 31 bombers in the attack force. The two groups were led by Lieutenant Tomu Nakamura, 705, and Lieutenant Commander Joji Hagai, 701. As TF-18 drove northwest at dusk, about 50 miles north of Rennell Island and roughly 160 miles south of Guadalcanal, several U.S. ships picked up unidentified aircraft on radar about 60 miles to the west. With daylight ending, the combat air patrol aircraft from the escort carriers recovered aboard their ships for the night, leaving the forward cruiser group without fighter cover. The tactical geometry then favored the attackers. The Japanese aircraft maneuvered to strike from the east, placing the U.S. ships against the remaining western twilight while approaching from the darker eastern sky. The first torpedo run began at 1919, when the 705 Air Group attacked. Its torpedoes failed to hit, and U.S. anti-aircraft fire shot down one bomber. Believing the danger had passed, Giffen ordered the force to stop zigzagging and continue on course and speed. A Japanese aircraft then marked TF-18's movement by dropping flares and floatlights. At 1938, the 701 Air Group attacked. Two torpedoes struck USS Chicago, causing flooding and a loss of propulsion that brought the cruiser to a stop. Another torpedo hit Wichita, but did not detonate. U.S. ships shot down two bombers during this second wave, including the aircraft associated with Hagai, who was killed. At 20:08, Giffen ordered the force to reverse direction, reduce speed to about 15 knots, and cease anti-aircraft firing to eliminate muzzle flashes that could silhouette the ships for further torpedo runs. The Japanese aircraft gradually disengaged and, by 23:35, had departed the area. In darkness, USS Louisville took the disabled Chicago in tow, and F-18 began moving south, away from the immediate approach routes to Guadalcanal, with the remaining cruisers and destroyers screening the withdrawal and the tow. The engagement off Rennell Island was not planned as a standalone battle by either side. It was a byproduct of two overlapping operational designs in the Central and Southern Solomons. Japan's plan to remove its remaining ground forces from Guadalcanal, and the Allied plan to sustain and reinforce the island while preparing to meet what intelligence staffs believed could be another Japanese surface and air counterstroke. For Japanese decision-makers, in early January 1943, the central calculation was that the costs of holding Guadalcanal had exceeded what the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy could sustain under Allied air pressure and naval interdiction. Imperial General Headquarters therefore directed Operation Key, a withdrawal to be executed by destroyer runs on 3 nights in early February. The aim was not simply to extract personnel, but to do so while preserving remaining destroyers and air units that were needed for the wider defense of the Bismarcks and New Guinea approaches. The plan ultimately evacuated 10,652 men, with hundreds dying during the withdrawal period and several thousand requiring extensive hospital care afterward. Operational security and deception were built into the Japanese approach. On January 1st, Japan changed radio communication codes, complicating Allied traffic analysis that had previously provided partial insight into Japanese intentions. As ship and aircraft concentrations increased at Truk, Rabaul, and the Shortlands, Allied analysts detected the buildup but debated its purpose. By late January, the Allied Pacific Command's intelligence section assessed that an operation labeled K pointed to a new Japanese offensive in either the Solomons or New Guinea, rather than a withdrawal from Guadalcanal. That analytical frame encouraged Allied commanders to position surface forces for interception, increasing the likelihood of contact with Japanese air power. Japanese planners paired the destroyer evacuation concept with an air campaign designed to shape the sea space around Guadalcanal. The method relied on three linked elements: submarine reconnaissance to maintain contact on Allied task forces, land-based bombers carrying aerial torpedoes to strike at night or at dusk when fighter cover was limited, and forward-based search aircraft to refine targeting. In the Rennell Island action, submarine reports from the approaches south of Guadalcanal triggered a torpedo bomber strike from Rabaul 16G-4M, Type 1 bombers from the 705 Air Group, and 16G-3M Type 96 bombers from the 701 Air Group, with one aircraft turning back, leaving 31 bombers to attack. On the Allied side, planning was shaped by a different uncertainty, whether Japan would attempt another reinforcement effort, a surface battle, or an air-heavy intervention against convoys. The immediate Allied objective was to deliver fresh troops and supplies to Guadalcanal, while keeping a cruiser-destroyer force positioned to respond if Japanese heavy ships appeared. That translated into a convoy with a close destroyer escort, and a separate covering force under Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, intended to protect the transports and, if conditions allowed, conduct an offensive sweep after the delivery. The main Allied planning misfit was speed and timing. Escort carriers used to provide air cover could not match the cruising speed of the cruiser force, and the need to meet schedules for rendezvous and subsequent operations pushed commanders toward splitting forces. At the tactical level, U.S. ship handling and screening emphasized the submarine threat expected in those waters, while the Japanese concept of operations prioritized air-launched torpedoes against ships that might temporarily lack fighter cover at dusk or at night. The battle, therefore, reflected not only opposing intentions, but also how each navy allocated attention across competing threats in the same operating area. After the two torpedo detonations, the immediate contest shifted from gunnery to survivability. USS Chicago lost propulsion as all four shafts stopped, ship control was degraded, and the rudder locked at 10 degrees left. Flooding extended from bulkhead 64 to about bulkhead 112, roughly 192 feet of the hull, and a starboard list developed rapidly to about 11 degrees as the ship settled by the stern. Steam pressure was lost, and normal electrical power failed in the flooded areas. What kept the cruiser afloat through the night was a system rather than a single action: compartmentation, emergency power, and improvised dewatering. Forward and after emergency diesel generators energized emergency and casualty circuits, which allowed emergency lighting and electric fire pumps to function, while portable submersible pumps were rigged where access was possible. With powered pumping limited by damage and by the distribution of electricity, crews also moved water by bucket brigades in some spaces. The goal was not to restore full capability, but to arrest progressive flooding long enough to stabilize trim and list. Stability management became a parallel fight. The ship's list was checked at about 11 degrees, and settling was halted with approximately 6 to 8 feet of freeboard remaining at the stern. Around midnight, about 4.5 hours after the hits, Chicago lit off number 4 boiler to regain limited steam services. Roughly an hour later, fuel oil booster pumps in nose. 1 and 2 fire rooms began pumping from intact starboard wing tanks as a form of liquid counter-flooding and trimming. By about 02:30, roughly 7 hours after the initial damage, the list had been removed. The ship was still badly compromised, but it had been brought to a condition where towing was feasible. Command decisions overnight reflected the same logic: preserve the damaged ship if it could be moved out of the immediate strike zone before dawn. Shortly after midnight, USS Louisville took Chicago in tow. With forward motion restored by tow, the rudder could be brought amidships by opening equalizing valves in the hydraulic system, and then locked there, simplifying steering for a ship that could not maneuver under its own power. The task force's movements emphasized concealment and distance from the likely axis of renewed attacks, while destroyers maintained a protective screen against both submarines and any renewed air approach. This first phase of the battle therefore ended without a decisive surface engagement and without territorial change, but with 2 measurable operational outcomes. First, the Japanese strike had forced the U.S. covering force into a recovery and withdrawal posture, consuming time, fuel, and destroyer effort on screening and towing rather than on offensive sweeps. Second, the Allied transport mission toward Guadalcanal continued under a different risk balance. Fewer heavy units remained positioned to contest the approaches, while Japanese air power demonstrated that it could still reach and hit major warships on the southern line of approach near Rennell. By dawn on the 30th of January 1943, the battle entered a new phase. The damaged USS Chicago was still afloat, but she was now a slow-moving objective that Japanese reconnaissance could reacquire in daylight. Admiral William F. Halsey treated the next hours as a race between salvage and renewed air attack. He ordered the escort carriers to maintain a continuous combat air patrol at first light, directed the Fleet Carrier Enterprise Task Force to close and reinforce the fighter cover, and dispatched the fleet tug USS Navajo to relieve USS Louisville of towing duties. At 8 a.m., Navajo took over the tow. Chicago remained under tow at low speed, with destroyers screening around the disabled cruiser. The operational problem for the U.S. force was visibility. Any Japanese scout that reached visual range could provide a corrected position report for torpedo bombers. Between daybreak and 1400 hours, multiple Japanese search aircraft probed the formation. U.S. fighters drove them off, but the scouting effort still produced the essential result for Japan. Chicago's approximate location and course were observed and reported. The Japanese air response on January 30th was organized as a daylight torpedo strike intended to finish the crippled cruiser and force the U.S. covering force farther south. At 12:15, Lieutenant Commander Kazuo Nishioka led 11 Mitsubishi G-4M torpedo bombers from the 751 Air Group, based at Kavieng and staging through Buka. The strike profile assumed that U.S. fighter cover might be present, but also that the damaged target and its screen would have limited maneuver room at towing speed. Warning reached the U.S. side through a separate intelligence channel. An Australian coast watcher reported the incoming bombers and estimated their arrival time at approximately 4 p.m. This provided time to concentrate fighters, but it also sharpened a command dilemma. Keeping the full cruiser force with Chicago increased anti-aircraft volume, yet also increased the number of major ships exposed to a coordinated torpedo attack. Halsey chose to reduce the risk to the broader task force. At 1500 hours, he ordered the other cruisers to depart for E-Fate in the New Hebrides, leaving Chicago with Navajo and 6 destroyers as escort. The decision separated the operational goal of preserving the damaged cruiser from the strategic need to keep the main surface force intact for later operations in the Solomons. By 1540, Enterprise was within 43 miles of Chicago. 10 Enterprise fighters were already overhead as combat air patrol. At this time, 4 fighters pursued and shot down a Japanese G-4M scout aircraft. At 1554, Enterprise radar detected the main strike, and Enterprise launched 10 more fighters. The escort carriers supporting the original screen had difficulty launching aircraft quickly, and their fighters did not reach the engagement in time to influence the torpedo run. As the 751 Air Group approached, the Japanese formation initially appeared to be lining up on Enterprise, but the intercepting fighters forced a change. Under pressure from the carrier fighters, the bombers turned toward Chicago, entering the anti-aircraft envelope of the destroyer screen. 6 Enterprise fighters engaged first. 4 more pursued, as the bombers crossed into concentrated fire from the escorts. The crisis peaked within minutes. 2 bombers were shot down before releasing torpedoes. 6 more were shot down moments later, but only after they dropped. In the compressed geometry of a towing formation, the U.S. ships had limited ability to evade without colliding or breaking the tow, while the attackers needed only a few successful torpedo tracks to decide the outcome. 1 torpedo struck the destroyer at USS La Valette in her forward engine room, killing 22 and causing heavy damage. Chicago was hit by 4 torpedoes, 1 forward of the bridge and 3 in the engineering spaces. With the ship's remaining stability and power systems collapsing beyond practical recovery, Captain Ralph O. Davis ordered abandon ship. Approximately 20 minutes later, Chicago sank stern first. USS Navajo and the escorting destroyers recovered 1,049 survivors from the water and from rafts while maintaining readiness for a possible follow-on attack. 62 of Chicago's crew died. A later Japanese torpedo bomber force failed to find the remaining U.S. ships, and Navajo took La Valette in tow as the damaged escort force withdrew south to reach port without further contact. The peak of the Battle of Rennell Island came on the afternoon of January 30th, 1943, when the battle compressed into a narrow set of minutes defined by three competing imperatives: keep a damaged heavy cruiser afloat, keep enough fighters overhead to disrupt a torpedo run, and keep the rest of the covering force from being drawn into a daylight strike zone south of Guadalcanal. The U.S. side treated the towing formation as a temporary solution, not an endpoint. Chicago under tow could not maneuver at the speed or with the turning radius expected of a cruiser in a torpedo attack, and the escorting destroyers had to balance anti-aircraft fire with collision avoidance and station keeping around the tow. For commanders, the critical risk was that daylight reconnaissance would convert a known general area into a precise attack datum for torpedo bombers. Once Japanese scouts regained contact, the probability of a coordinated radar-guided fighter interception dropped to a question of timing and distance rather than intent. When the main torpedo strike arrived, the tactical picture was different from the previous evening. On January 29th, the U.S. force had been attacked at dusk without fighter cover. On 30 January, there were fighters overhead, and radar warning from the carrier task force enabled additional launches. The Japanese formation, flying land-based torpedo bombers, faced two layers of resistance: interception by carrier fighters beyond the ship screen, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire once it committed to the final run. That combination imposed losses on the attackers before and during weapons release, but it did not remove the underlying geometry of the target. A large ship moving at towing speed could not evade torpedoes in the same way as a maneuvering cruiser. The decisive moment came with the torpedo hits. La Valette was struck in her forward engineering spaces, producing immediate casualties and sharply reducing her fighting efficiency. Chicago then absorbed multiple torpedo impacts concentrated around the engineering and after sections, where the earlier flooding and system failures had already limited redundancy. The cumulative effect exceeded what damage control could reverse. Once progressive flooding and loss of remaining services made the ship untenable, the command decision shifted from preservation to survival: abandon ship, then recover as many personnel as possible before a follow-on attack. Rescue operations became part of the battle rather than its aftermath. Destroyers in the towing tug maneuvered to pick up men in the water while maintaining an anti-submarine and anti-air posture, because a second strike could arrive with little warning once survivors clustered around ships that had slowed for recovery. The U.S. escort recovered more than 1,000 survivors. The losses were concentrated but specific: 62 dead from Chicago, 22 dead from La Valette, and a major cruiser removed from the operational order of battle in the South Pacific at a time when cruiser strength was being rationed across multiple fronts. For Japan, the peak had a dual character. The sinking of Chicago represented the tactical objective of the airstrike concept: use land-based torpedo bombers to neutralize a U.S. surface covering force operating beyond continuous fighter protection. But the cost was also immediate and measurable. The daylight strike lost most of its attacking bombers to fighters and shipboard anti-aircraft fire, reducing available trained crews and aircraft for subsequent operations from the same bases. The attack achieved a ship kill, yet it did so by spending a portion of the limited air groups tasked with covering the wider Operation K evacuation effort. The battle's peak therefore produced asymmetrical but comparable consequences. The United States lost a heavy cruiser and temporarily shifted its naval posture from offensive interception toward force preservation and convoy completion. Japan demonstrated that it could still project effective land-based torpedo power into the southern approaches to Guadalcanal, but it did so while accepting aircraft and crew losses that could not be quickly replaced in early 1943. After Chicago sank, both sides adapted in ways that reflected their constraints rather than their preferences. For the U.S. Navy, the immediate requirement was to withdraw damaged ships, consolidate survivors, and re-establish a coherent screen against submarines while remaining alert for a second airstrike. For Japanese air units, the requirement was to continue supporting Operation K with search and strike capacity despite losses in trained air crews and aircraft sustained during the daylight torpedo attack. On the U.S. side, the escort force reorganized around two practical tasks: towing and recovery. USS Navajo took the damaged destroyer USS La Valette in tow, converting a combat screen into a protection detail for a slow-moving casualty. Destroyers that had been positioned for anti-aircraft defense shifted to anti-submarine patterns and to survivor recovery, because any pause to pick up men increased vulnerability to submarines operating on the same approach lines. The force then withdrew to the south to reach repair facilities, accepting that it could not maintain a surface presence near Guadalcanal at the same density while towing and while damaged. This episode reinforced doctrinal lessons that U.S. commanders were already learning in the Solomons. First, cruiser-destroyer forces operating within reach of land-based torpedo bombers required either continuous fighter cover or movement schedules that minimize daylight exposure in predictable approach corridors. Second, splitting forces to match the speed of slower escort carriers created windows where surface groups could be engaged without immediate air support. Third, radar warning alone was not sufficient if fighter launch and assembly times were constrained by distance, deck cycles, or the availability of carrier groups on the right bearing. U.S. adaptation was not limited to tactics. Operationally, the loss of a heavy cruiser affected how surface forces were allocated in the South Pacific. In early 1943, major warships were being distributed between escort duty, interdiction sweeps, and readiness for major fleet engagements that planners still anticipated somewhere in the Central or Southwest Pacific. Losing Chicago reduced the margin for error. In practice, this encouraged more conservative exposure of cruiser forces in areas where Japanese land-based aircraft could reach and where U.S. carrier cover could not be guaranteed. For the Japanese side, adaptation was visible in how the air campaign was managed around the Guadalcanal withdrawal. The 11th Air Fleet strike succeeded in sinking a heavy cruiser, but bomber losses reduced immediate operational capacity. Japanese commanders therefore depended more heavily on reconnaissance coordination and on selective engagement opportunities rather than repeated large strikes. Submarines and forward air search continued to work as the locating mechanism, while bomber sorties were concentrated where contact quality was high enough to justify expending torpedoes and crews. At the same time, Japanese adaptation was shaped by the overriding goal of Operation K: protect the destroyer evacuation runs and prevent Allied interference long enough to complete the withdrawal. The Rennell strike functioned as an example of support by disruption, forcing Allied naval groups to withdraw and spend time on salvage. Even when air units absorbed losses, the effect was to reduce the probability that the U.S. Navy would place large surface forces south of Guadalcanal during the critical evacuation nights in early February. The human dimension of adaptation was different in each force, but driven by comparable realities. For U.S. crews, damage control and rescue at sea became the continuation of combat under the threat of renewed attack, with survival depending on training, discipline, and the ability to coordinate multiple ships around a sinking target. For Japanese air crews, mission profiles required long overwater navigation, coordination between search, strike, and flare-marking elements, and a final torpedo run into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. In both cases, operational outcomes rested on whether units could absorb losses and continue functioning at the required tempo, not on symbolic results. By the end of 30 January, the engagement had ended, but it had produced an adaptation effect that extended beyond the immediate casualties. The U.S. Navy adjusted its assumptions about how far south of Guadalcanal it could operate surface forces without continuous air cover. Japanese planners confirmed that a coordinated land-based torpedo strike, enabled by submarine scouting, could still impose a major loss on U.S. surface strength in early 1943, yet also confirmed that doing so required accepting aircraft losses that constrained future sorties. The turning point created by the Battle of Rennell Island was not a change in territory, but a change in freedom of action during the final days of the Guadalcanal campaign. After 30 January 1943, the U.S. Navy had fewer heavy ships positioned on the southern approach to Guadalcanal, and commanders had a clearer demonstration that Japanese land-based torpedo bombers, guided by scouting, could still impose decisive damage on surface forces operating without continuous fighter cover. The operational response was to reduce exposure in the exact sea space Japan needed to keep comparatively uncontested for several nights. Japan used that window to prioritize the main objective of Operation K, remove the remaining ground force from Guadalcanal, with destroyers operating at night. The evacuation was scheduled in 3 main destroyer runs, on the nights of February 1st to 2nd, February 4th to 5th, and February 7th to 8th, 1943. The destroyers arrived off Cape Esperance and the northwestern coast, embarked troops under tight time limits, and withdrew before daylight to avoid Allied air attack. The final outcome was the evacuation of 10,652 Japanese personnel from Guadalcanal. From the Allied perspective, the crucial uncertainty was interpretive as much as tactical. Intelligence indicators had suggested a major Japanese operation, but the question was whether that meant reinforcement, a counter-offensive, or withdrawal. Even after the first February night, the activity could still be read as a resupply effort because the movements looked similar, fast destroyers entering at night and departing before dawn. That ambiguity reduced the likelihood of a single decisive interception plan. Instead, Allied forces applied pressure through airstrikes and patrols, attempting to attrit shipping and disrupt night runs, rather than committing major surface units into the same approach corridor that had just produced a heavy cruiser loss. For Japanese planners, Rennell did not remove risk. It redistributed it. Bomber losses on January 30th reduced the margin for repeated large torpedo strikes, and the evacuation destroyers still faced attack by day if caught in the open. But the battle helped shift the immediate threat calculus. With U.S. cruiser forces pulled back and reorganizing, and with carrier groups managing their own exposure, the probability of a concentrated surface interception on the evacuation route declined during the exact week Japan needed maximum predictability. The most decisive operational decision in this phase was therefore not made on the water south of Guadalcanal, but in how each side allocated assets in early February. Japan accepted the expenditure of aircraft and aircrew to reduce Allied surface pressure and protect the evacuation schedule. The United States accepted a lower-risk posture for heavy surface forces and relied more heavily on air power and patrols to contest the evacuation indirectly. The consequence was that Japan's withdrawal plan remained intact long enough to complete the removal of its troops. When Allied ground patrols reached the expected Japanese positions and found them empty, the strategic meaning became clear. On February 9, 1943, the Guadalcanal campaign was officially declared over by the Allied command, based on confirmation that Japanese forces had departed. In retrospect, the Battle of Rennell Island functioned as the inflection point that reduced the likelihood of a late, high-risk U.S. surface intervention during the evacuation window, while Japan's successful extraction of personnel converted a battlefield defeat on land into a controlled operational disengagement at sea. With USS Chicago lost and USS La Valette damaged, the U.S. Navy treated the end of the Rennell Island action as a controlled withdrawal under continuing threat rather than a clean break in contact. Destroyers in the fleet tug, USS Navajo, concentrated on 2 immediate tasks: recover personnel from the water and bring damaged ships south to repair facilities. The rescue was completed while maintaining anti-submarine watches and readiness for renewed air attack, because a slow-moving towing group created a predictable target if Japanese scouts regained contact. Casualties and material losses were specific and immediate. Chicago went down with 62 of her crew. About 1,049 survivors were recovered by the escorts. The Valette suffered a torpedo hit that killed 22 and required towing and prolonged repair. For the U.S. covering force, the aftermath also included the loss of a major unit from the available cruiser inventory in the South Pacific, reducing flexibility for escort, bombardment, and interception missions during the transition from Guadalcanal to the next stages of the Solomons campaign. The tactical end state at sea did not change control of any island, but it did change how forces were positioned over the following days. U.S. cruiser groups that had been operating on the southern approach to Guadalcanal were pulled back to reorganize, refuel, and restore readiness. This withdrawal was not a general retreat from the theater. It was a redistribution of risk away from the specific corridor where land-based torpedo aircraft could attack at dusk or in daylight when fighter coverage was thin or delayed. For Japan, the aftermath was measured against the priority that drove operations in late January: create enough operational space to execute the Guadalcanal evacuation schedule. The Rennell strikes had imposed a real cost on U.S. surface strength, but they also consumed aircraft and experienced crews. U.S. reports credited anti-aircraft fire and carrier fighters with shooting down 1 bomber in the first evening attack and 2 more in the second, then 8 bombers during the 30th of January daylight strike. Japanese loss figures for the same episodes differ in detail across post-war accounting, but both sides recognize that the attacks traded a significant fraction of the available bomber force for the destruction of a heavy cruiser. The immediate operational consequence was a reduction in the likelihood of a concentrated U.S. surface interception during the first week of February. Allied forces continued to contest Japanese movements primarily through air patrols and strikes rather than by committing heavy surface units into the same southern approach line while repairing damage and absorbing losses. Japanese destroyers then executed the planned night withdrawals associated with Operation Kie, extracting 10,652 personnel from Guadalcanal over 3 main evacuation nights in early February. On 9th February 1943, Allied ground reconnaissance confirmed that Japanese forces had departed, and the Guadalcanal campaign was formally declared concluded. The human aftermath extended beyond the casualty totals. For U.S. personnel, the battle ended with mass recovery at sea, redistribution of survivors to other ships, and the administrative and medical processing that followed a sinking far from shore facilities. For Japanese air units, the aftermath centered on replacing aircraft and air crews that could not be rapidly regenerated in early 1943, while maintaining enough search and strike capability to cover the evacuation's final stages. In the immediate weeks after Rennell, both navies adjusted their posture. The U.S. Navy preserved carrier and surface strength for the next phase of the Solomons advance, while the Japanese Navy completed a withdrawal that preserved thousands of soldiers for later defensive campaigns. The battle's final effect was therefore not a territorial transfer, but a short-term shift in operational tempo and force allocation during the final exit from Guadalcanal. The Battle of Rennell Island is best understood as a linking event between 2 phases of the Pacific War, the end of the Guadalcanal struggle and the beginning of a more methodical Allied advance through the Central Solomons. Its immediate military significance was narrow but measurable. A U.S. heavy cruiser was sunk by Japanese land-based torpedo bombers, and a destroyer was damaged in the final days of a campaign whose outcome on land had already become unfavorable for Japan. The wider significance lay in how the battle shaped decisions and perceptions at a moment when both sides were trying to control the terms of disengagement. For Japan, the battle's legacy is tied to Operation K. The evacuation of 10,652 men from Guadalcanal preserved a substantial portion of the remaining force for later operations and reduced the political and military cost of a total destruction of the garrison. Rennell contributed by imposing caution on U.S. surface forces operating south of Guadalcanal during the critical week of the withdrawal. At the same time, the cost of achieving that effect included bomber and aircrew losses that further narrowed Japan's capacity to sustain high-tempo air operations from Rabaul and Kavieng as Allied pressure increased later in 1943. For the United States, the legacy was operational and doctrinal. Rennell reinforced that surface forces operating within range of enemy land-based aircraft required either continuous fighter cover or a movement plan that minimized predictable daylight exposure in approach corridors. It also reinforced the limitations of dividing forces around speed mismatches. Escort carriers could provide fighters, but if separated from the cruisers they were intended to protect, gaps emerged at dusk and at the margins of fighter range. These were not abstract lessons. They were directly applicable to the next stages of the Solomons campaign, where Allied forces would repeatedly operate under the umbrella of Japanese air power from Rabaul until that base could be neutralized. In historiography, Rennell is often described as the last major naval engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. That framing can obscure its character. It was not a surface gun battle for control of a strait, but an air-delivered torpedo engagement enabled by submarine scouting and timed to a campaign transition. The event therefore illustrates a broader pattern in the Pacific. Decisive effects were increasingly produced by the interaction of reconnaissance, air attack, and the constraints of range and endurance, rather than by battleships or cruiser squadrons seeking a classic line of battle encounter. The battle also highlights how both sides interpreted the same operational environment differently. U.S. commanders moved to cover convoys and prepare to meet an anticipated Japanese counterstroke. Japanese commanders moved to protect a withdrawal and to discourage interference. The clash emerged because each side's planning assumptions produced naval movement into the same sea space, and because both sides depended on imperfect intelligence and time-sensitive decisions. The U.S. loss of Chicago did not reverse the Guadalcanal outcome, but it altered the risk calculus of where and how to employ surface forces. Japanese success in sinking a cruiser did not restore the initiative, but it supported a controlled disengagement that preserved personnel. In long-term strategic terms, the conclusion of Guadalcanal in February 1943 and Japan's evacuation marked a transition from expansion to defense in the Southern Pacific. The United States and its allies gained a forward base structure that enabled continued advances toward New Georgia, Bougainville, and ultimately the neutralization of Rabaul by air power and isolation. Japan retained the ability to inflict the local losses, as Rennell demonstrated, but faced a tightening imbalance in industrial output, trained aircrew replacement, and ship availability. Memory and commemoration of Rennell have tended to be shaped by its timing. It occurred after months of intense fighting and amid a strategic shift that made later operations more prominent. For naval historians, its enduring value lies in what it reveals about early 1943, a period when the tactical threat from Japanese torpedo aviation remained high, but the strategic context was shifting toward Allied accumulation of airfields, carriers, and logistics that would progressively reduce the freedom of action that made such strikes possible.